Addiction can be devastating. Chances are you have known someone, maybe even someone in your own family, who has struggled with an addiction to cigarettes or alcohol or drugs. But what about an addiction to sex? Compulsive sexual behavior that's out of control. A growing number of medical experts are saying it's a very real disorder that millions of Americans are fighting, men and women. Here's Keith Morrison.
Sex was the answer.
With sex, I always wanted more.
Sex, it's something that just completely overtakes you.
Sex. It's a biological necessity, something we're supposed to desire, yet be able to control. But for an estimated 16 million Americans, the urge for sex is anything but controlled. In fact, some say it's an addiction.
Daily, I sit down with people who look back at the wreckage in their life and they say, I've known all along. Why would I do this stuff?
Dr. Patrick Carnes, Director of Sexual Disorder Services at Arizona's Meadows Treatment Center, first coined the term sexual addiction. He says the same way people can be addicted to drugs or alcohol or gambling, they can be addicted to sex. Anything from internet sex to obsessive masturbation to out-and-out affairs.
How can you tell what makes a person a sex addict as opposed to just liking sex?
You look for the obvious things like bad things happening, knowing that you're doing something that's going to hurt you, so you make efforts to stop that don't work. Obviously, you got a problem.
There was that selfish, needy, lonely, angry part of myself that didn't want to stop and saw that sex was my solution to all of those other things.
Mark Laser seemed to have an insatiable need for secret sex. To anyone who knew him, it would have seemed incomprehensible. He was married with children, a minister, a counselor, an icon of respect, but that wasn't enough, Mark says. Early on, he felt an emptiness, a loneliness that sex seemed to fill.
It was just an excitement, a raw excitement, a rush, kind of like what a drug addict would describe. It was just a high.
He was 11, he says, when he discovered pictures, what we'd call soft porn now.
And some of that is not abnormal for, a person seeing that for the first time. Of course, what becomes abnormal is how preoccupied you get with it.
He was so fixated by what he saw, so excited, so attracted. He started stealing Playboy magazines from the local drugstore.
I started crossing moral boundaries almost right away.
Stealing magazines?
Stealing magazines. And, see, I'm a preacher's kid. I'm a minister's son, so I knew that stealing was bad, but I was willing to go ahead with it because the high was so fantastic of what I was experiencing.
In high school, Mark hoped his behavior might stop when he met Debbie, the girl he thought could change him.
There was a part of myself that she just, didn't know because I wasn't revealing it to her or anybody, for that matter.
He wasn't revealing that he was now doing more than looking at magazines. He was watching porn videos, masturbating daily. Debbie, unaware of Mark's double life, trusted him completely, and they got married. Mark hoped that married life would bring an end to a life preoccupied by sex.
All this crazy stuff in the past, that'll all be over now that I'm getting married. I'll have a regular sexual partner and so forth. But I was amazed early on, even in the first year of marriage, that my temptation to masturbate and look at pornography and so forth returned rather quickly.
But a lot of people think, well, human beings are preoccupied by sex a lot of the time. What would be so unusual about your feelings?
The part that was unusual is where my mind tended to want to go with it. I mean, I wanted to experience it. I wanted to act it out. Eventually, I had a lot of preoccupation with planning or doing or thinking what it would be like.
Mark soon was no longer planning, but doing. Paying monthly visits to massage parlors, having sex with so-called masseuses, all the while hiding it from Debbie, whom Mark says he still loved deeply.
I was always, completely attracted to her. There was just something so much deeper in me that cannot be satisfied by sex.
Just something deeply emotional was missing.
That is right.
Did you wonder why you didn't just stop?
Probably a million times over the course of my acting out history.
I was wrecked with shame, and I tried time and time and time again to stop.
Like Mark, Marnie Fareed knows what it's like to be out of control. For Marnie, it wasn't so much about the sex itself, but about the relationship she thought she could have by engaging in sex with acquaintances and friends.
The sexual part was pleasurable, and it was a nice byproduct for me, but that wasn't the most important thing. I was trying to get non-sexual needs met sexually, and that was the only way I knew how to meet those needs.
Marnie says as a child she was sexually abused by a family friend, a not uncommon precursor to later addiction. Marnie's promiscuity lasted from her teen years through 2 marriages, with numerous affairs. She felt an emotional void, she says, that sex filled, at least initially.
It's a connection that I found I couldn't replicate anywhere else, but immediately after that experience is over, I mean, driving back home, there is this incredible letdown that you're just awash in shame.
Shame that worsened after Marnie was diagnosed with cervical cancer. The cause, she was told, sexually transmitted disease.
That was the lowest point. I experienced 3 surgeries in a year as treatment of that cervical cancer, had a major problem with hemorrhaging after one of those surgeries. I mean, my life literally was in danger. And I found still that I could not stop.
She was sick, married, a mother, and yet none of those things could make Marnie change, even though she was horrified by what she was doing.
It's about feeling rotten. I want to feel better. What ways am I going through a ritual to feel better? I'm connecting with someone. I'm going to act out sexually. I feel horrible after that, and the whole cycle starts over again.
Marnie was desperate. Sex with her husband was not enough. And she believed the only way to stop having sex outside her marriage was to end her life.
I had really strong suicidal thoughts, but I knew I couldn't keep on living, but I was too afraid to die.
I've sometimes gone home with people who I'm not even that attracted to, and yet I feel like if I don't have sex with them, like it's just the most horrible feeling.
This woman, we'll call her Karen, was overtaken too by the addiction and by her own shame, so raw that she asked us to hide her face and use a different name.
It's just this 24-hour distraction. Like the shame that causes, I feel like it just stole my soul.
Karen is in her 30s. She's single, and for almost as long as she can remember, she's been preoccupied with finding love, which for years, she says, meant having sex several times a week with strangers she would pick up in bars, frequently putting herself in dangerous situations.
I ended up going home with a group of young guys, like 10 years younger than me, and I figured that I would have sex with one of them and maybe have a relationship, but I ended up having sex or doing sexual things with several of them, and that was a new low.
How'd you feel after that?
Absolutely humiliated. What horrified me the most about it is that these guys were graffiti writers, and they wrote on my body. And that's what made me feel, you know, like waking up in the morning, seeing like these names on my body, that made me feel like, oh my God, I was just completely used as an object.
You don't find yourself contemplating prostitution or anything like that?
Yeah, that actually seemed like almost like a logical thing to do, since I found myself, you know, having sex with people I didn't really know anyway. And I kind of became obsessed with some ads in the back of a free newspaper for escort services, and I went on a couple of interviews.
Mark Laser was also building toward behavior he would never have thought was possible for him. Remember, he had degrees in religion and divinity, had attended seminary school, was a deeply committed Christian who, by this time, was an ordained minister.
There was that good side, there was that moral side, there was that caring side.
And yet, he'd escape, furtive and guilty, to feed his sexual addiction. At the same time, he was working on getting his Ph.D. in, of all things, psychology.
Now I'm the Reverend Dr. Laser, and there's people that are going to be attracted to that, and I actually wound up becoming sexual with some of my clients at that time.
Did this happen once, twice?
No, it happened multiple times, yeah, over a 10-year period of time.
How would you feel after doing something like that?
Frightened, incredibly frightened.
Afraid somebody would report you?
Yeah, that mainly. I think for years I'd felt totally worthless. Can't begin to describe to you the times I would sit in church, even preaching on a Sunday morning, thinking that God's grace was for everybody else, but certainly not for me.
Mark preached redemption. Redemption for him might be more difficult.
A shameful secret is exposed.
I was totally blindsided. I had no idea that this man I had been married to for 15 years could possibly have been doing all of these things.
Can his life, his marriage, be saved?
Mark Laser should have known better. He was married with children, a minister who preached to a trusting congregation. He was a therapist counseling others, but still he could not deal with his own demon, sexual addiction. Now, masturbation and pornography weren't enough. Mark added affairs with women he was counseling to his sexual repertoire.
It was ramping up into just that totally egregious behavior. That's the totally worst part of my story that I'm the most ashamed of.
You're somebody who has been entrusted with the mental, emotional health of someone else. They trust you implicitly.
It's a total betrayal. It's totally abusive. There's no question about it.
Mark betrayed parishioners, colleagues, clients. It was a trust about to be shattered.
One of the people that I was involved with had reported that, and so...
Just the thing you were terribly afraid of, right?
Yeah, the very thing that I was afraid of, it actually happened. 8 very angry people called me in, canceled my appointments for that day.
Did you realize what they knew?
Not until the first one opened their mouth and started talking, and then all of a sudden it all came crashing in on me.
Mark's colleagues at the center where he was a counselor angrily confronted him and fired him. They would help Mark get treatment for his sexual misbehavior, but first they said he had to tell his wife, Debbie, everything.
I was totally blindsided. I had no idea that this man I had been living with for 15 years, married to for 15 years, could possibly have been doing all of these things. I'll never forget the look on Mark's face, actually. He was sitting in a chair across from me, and I guess today what I know as brokenness in a person is exactly what he was.
He'd never been broken before.
Not in my eyes.
Did you think that there was a significant likelihood that you'd be able to save your marriage all along?
I think there were times, truthfully, when I questioned whether I would stay. There are times, I know, when I felt so extremely sad that I wasn't sure we would ever be able to have happiness in our life again.
And then, in the midst of all that pain, Mark felt something else.
This pent-up secret that is now over 30 years old, now all of a sudden is out of the bag. I don't have to protect the secret anymore. And so I think mixed in with all the fear, the sadness, the confusion, there was a sense of relief.
Is it really about the sex? No. That's the mistake that people often make. It's really about pain.
Pain?
Or escaping, or anxiety reduction. It's a solution.
Marty Faree thought sex was her solution to painful feelings, but it was a solution that was not working. After years of failing to will herself to stop having sex with acquaintances, she was ready to take her own life. And then, at last, she confided in someone.
I picked up the phone and I called a dear friend and poured out this awful saga of my life and said, I need help.
Marnie got help. A therapist helped her learn to deal with the childhood sexual abuse that contributed to her many affairs. Her second marriage survived, and is, she says, better. Marnie was surprised to find she wasn't alone. About a third of sex addicts are female, which is why, to do something to help other women, she went back to school to get a degree in counseling. Marnie now runs a counseling program for sexually addicted women.
Women are afraid to talk about it. We're afraid of being labeled as whores. It's kind of, guys will be guys, men will be men, but for a woman to be out of control in her sexual behavior, there is just a whole nother level of shame.
It took over everything.
Karen, awash in that same shame, one day found herself surfing the internet to see if she was the only woman in the world who suffered her way, which is how she came across websites for sexual addiction. She learned about and entered a 12-step program and has been dealing with sex appropriately for a year.
If you go into an AA meeting,
Yes?
and the problem is booze,
Yes?
you say, today I didn't have a drink.
Yes.
And that's today. I'll worry about tomorrow.
Yeah, yes, right.
How do you do that with sex?
It is a problem, and the real problem is, for most sex addicts, they would say to you, I wouldn't know healthy sexuality if it hit me over the head. So how do I know when am I being in my craziness and when am I doing, which is a normal, healthy reaction to have? And that's part of what recovery teaches.
Mark Laser's been in recovery for over a decade. He says it's a continuing process. After his sexual misbehavior was exposed, Mark entered a sex addiction treatment center for a month, received psychotherapy, still occasionally goes for counseling, and relies on the support of those around him, like Debbie, who stayed by his side through it all.
I never had these real feelings of just running and leaving. I wasn't aware that running would solve anything necessarily.
Mark and Debbie's relationship eventually strengthened. They dealt with some of the loneliness Mark felt, and both found comfort in their religious faith.
Now that Debbie and I are more spiritually intimate, sex in our relationship is totally satisfying.
Mark's work has also helped him. He's again counseling others, including men with problems like his.
You know, we know about being addicted to cigarettes or alcohol or cocaine. It's a chemical. Why can't sex addicts just stop?
When you have a compulsive gambling problem, you're not taking a chemical. When you're compulsively overeating, you're not taking a chemical. In other words, we produce those chemicals in our brain whether we use an outside chemical or not.
Increasingly, studies like this one at Vanderbilt University are being undertaken to see if brains of sex addicts are somehow different, if sex addiction is a true, measurable disorder. Yet despite growing interest in such research, there are still some who do not believe it's a true addiction. The American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic manual, for example, doesn't list sexual addiction as a disorder.
This is not even a category in the Psychiatric Association's handbook.
Yep.
So they're not buying it.
That book is always changing. And a consensus is starting to build. People who work in the addiction realm are starting to get a common agreement about how to start describing this.
But however the scientific debate works out, people like Marnie and Karen and Mark want to help other people recognize the problem they could not and find out that there is hope.
I confused sex and love. I thought that sex was love.
Sex is a false solution. Only I didn't know that.
Good girl. You can live life differently. There is help. It is possible to recover.
You'll find more information on sexual addiction and ways to treat it on our website. The address is dateline.msnbc.com.